Okay, so well, welcome to today's webinar. Our topic today, a bright future for US passenger rail. What we're going to be covering today is, first of all, why we're even having a webinar. Why could there possibly be a brighter future for the US passenger rail? For those of you who know the US, it's probably not the highlight of what the country has at the moment. But we're going to talk about why it's actually now a topic. I'm then going to delve a little bit into what rail is in the USA, a little bit of history of how we got to where we are today, and then the way passenger rail is structured and some of the things that are happening now in the country, which are quite exciting. There is a real vision for passenger rail. I'm going to talk about the way the US government is promoting passenger rail and a number of other initiatives that are underway at the moment, which is really changing the landscape. We'll then round up with the tailwinds, so what's going to propel passenger rail growing in the US, and some of the headwinds that could actually get in the way, put some kind of sand in the gears of this happening. And then I'll give my conclusions about whether I believe there's a bright future for passenger rail. Hopefully there's enough that I've covered that you might have your own as well. And as Kaya mentioned, I do plan to leave 10-15 minutes at the end for any questions that you might have. So please, I put them in the chat in the Q&A box during the presentation, or wait until I finish talking. We can wait for you to type those in. Okay, so let's just start. Passenger rail. What do most people think of when they think about passenger rail in the US? Typically, it's old trains, these huge, beautiful, colossal stations that are in all of the metro areas, but stations that have maybe 1 or 2 trains per day. And commuter rail lines where they use huge locomotives, maybe pulling 2 or 3 passenger coaches, great big double-deck coaches, which have about half a dozen people sat on them. All seems to be from a different age and kind of missing some of the advances that's happened with multiple units and modern rolling stock. So we don't start in a great place. Passenger miles for intercity rail since the 70s has gradually increased. So over that 50 years or 45 years in this chart here, as you can see, passenger rail has now just slightly increased its footprint. Compare that to domestic air travel, which has grown by more than 4.5 times in terms of passenger mile, and car usage as well has grown, well, more than as doubled. So a bit of a malaise, it's fair to say. However, the reason why we've got this webinar, when this man was elected president of the US, so Joe Biden, otherwise known as Amtrak Joe, he implemented a huge stimulus package for the US country, focused on infrastructure and jobs. And a key part of that was passenger rail. Over $60 billion have been put towards developing passenger rail in the US. So we have Joe Biden. We also have other, what I call stars aligning. Congestion in the US is getting worse, not better. There now seems to be a realization that just building more and more roads, more lanes, is just inducing even more demand, as opposed to solving congestion that exists in all of the metro areas within the country. There's also more of an outward-looking view within the US, looking at how other countries, China's the example in this photo, but I mean European countries as well, that have invested in rail and high-speed rail networks. Really, the US could be missing out on a trick here. There's no reason why that works elsewhere and wouldn't work in the US. Domestic air travel has grown significantly in the US, and there is a tremendous network here domestically in the US. But there's a lot of consolidation in that industry. Fares are going up rather than down, and comfort levels are definitely going down rather than up. And we also have some other great news. There's a new rail line called Brightline, I'll talk about later, which has proven that, yes, you can operate attractive and successful passenger rail in the US. And we've also got some genuine high-speed rail projects, some of which have started, others are really looking like they're going to happen. And you know, that's why we came up with this webinar title. Maybe there is a bright future for US rail. Before I go any further, I did want to just cover one point, and that is terminology. So those of you that have worked in the US, the rail industry internationally will know that in North America, there is a different vocabulary for lots of the terms that we use. I just got some examples here. The use of railway ties instead of sleepers. It's a grade crossing and not a level crossing. My intention today is to try and use what I'd call the international English terms. So we'll talk about train drivers and we'll talk about coaches. However, I have lived in the US for the last 10 years or so. I might slip into some American English terms as well, so forgive me for that. Okay, so let's kick off with what rail is in the USA. And we start off with American exceptionalism. The rail industry is an example of this. The US is the only large industrialized rich country where freight is the primary rail operation. It's not passenger. And if we look at the rail network in the USA, we've got a 100,000-mile network. I mean, that is down from 200,000 miles and from the 70s, but it is still the largest rail network in the world. It still outstrips China. And the interesting fact about this rail network is that it is majority freight railways. And those freight railways are all privately owned and they're vertically integrated. They own the track, they run the trains, they own all the facilities, they maintain all of the infrastructure. Now, there are hundreds of freight railways in the US, although there's 6 major ones. They're called Class 1s, and they run something like 70% of that mileage, and they account for around about 90% of all freight revenues. So they are huge, and they're the big names I'm sure most of you have heard of, like Union Pacific Railroad, BNSF, CSX, Norfolk Southern, and a couple of Canadian railways, which actually own a lot of property within the US, Canadian National and CPKC. Let's then have a look at passenger rail ownership in the US. Now, bear in mind, the US is primarily a private sector rail industry, but passenger ownership is where actually the state or the state-run national rail operator, which is Amtrak, does own some infrastructure. As you can see, it's pretty limited. Small bit in the Midwest between Chicago and Detroit. And then the significant one is that on the right-hand side, which is the Northeast Corridor route, which runs from Washington, D.C. up through Philadelphia, New York, and up to Boston. Additionally to that, there is the Bright Line route down in the southeast corner in Florida. But with the exception maybe of a few cities, so New York and Boston are examples where the local transit agency do own the lines. That doesn't apply in every city. In Chicago and Seattle, for example, those lines are still owned by freight companies, and the local commuter rail has to negotiate access and paths to operate them. But as you can see, we have really a freight-dominated rail network. And then when we overlay Amtrak's network over the US map, we probably come to see what some of the challenges are of passenger rail in the US. As you can see, the majority of the network is using other people's rails. So it's on the host railways, those freight companies. And that is a challenge. Access rights, the quality of the actual infrastructure, which is obviously designed for freight. These are all issues which do affect passenger rail, and we'll come into a little bit later. So how did we get to here? And we just have to do a little bit of history. So the US rail industry in the 1960s, late 1960s, was really on its knees. All of the railway companies were really struggling. There was a host of mergers, a huge consolidation in the industry as they were trying to avoid bankruptcy. The reason for that is that they were highly regulated. But most of their business was actually freight. even back in the 50s and 60s. And as the US built a national interstate road system, road transportation started to really kind of eat away at their freight business. On top of that, they were highly regulated, prices were set, they had services that they had to operate, and as a result, it was untenable. And in the early 70s, the US government, this is the Nixon administration, stepped in and they did reforms for the industry. On the freight side, they essentially took away, over the next 10 years, a lot of those regulations. And that's why today we have a very, very successful freight rail industry in the US. Private companies that make huge Silicon Valley level profits, and they are very large businesses, probably the most profitable railroads in the entire world. But the cost of those reforms, that deregulation, was on passenger rail. The government essentially enabled all these railways to give up their passenger rail commitments. They said, if you don't want to operate passenger rail anymore, that's fine, we'll pick them up. And that's when they created Amtrak. So Amtrak was created in 1970, and essentially 22 different long-distance point-to-point routes were identified that will be that national network. None of the freight rail companies opted to keep any passenger rail. It was all really handed over to the state operator. Within 10 years of Amtrak starting, their services were already being stripped down. So a number of these routes were just discontinued, and the remainder had their services significantly reduced. And that's why today on the Amtrak route network, we have one train a day on most routes, particularly long distance ones. And the shorter distance ones, it's rare that you get more than 3 or 4 trains a day. Which, if you think in the size of the US, the size of the cities these are connecting, that really kind of doesn't seem to reflect a demand that you would see. So really, to conclude, by the time you got to the early 80s, when the rest of the developed world was really investing in rail, high-speed rail programs, it seemed like the US was perhaps going backwards. So where are we today in 2024? This map here shows the Amtrak network as it is today. And, you know, if you look at the map, it looks fairly comprehensive. I'd say most of the major cities, the majority of the major cities in the US are on here, they're connected. But then you have to look at the service. And as I said, the frequencies, one train a day is not really realistic for an intercity rail network. On top of that, the journey times are unbelievably slow. It is 99% the case that it's quicker to drive than use the train. One of the reasons for that is that the freight railways own this infrastructure. They provide paths to Amtrak, but Amtrak does not have priority. Their schedules and timetables will reflect that. So an example here, the California Zephyr is a train that runs from Chicago to San Francisco. That's 2,500 miles, and it takes nearly 3 days. And that train sits for long periods of time at stations. Essentially, it's like a tourist train rather than really a realistic way to get between any of these points on here, not just Chicago to the West Coast. You've also got to think as well about other factors affecting Amtrak. The way that they're structured, the fact that they are state-owned means that their funding, their ability to upgrade their rolling stock has really been limited by the government policy at the time. As a result, they have old trains, they have reliability issues, and on top of that, they're running on infrastructure which is only maintained to freight standards. Now, there is an exception, and that is that Northeast corridor I spoke about, which runs between Washington through New York to Boston. That is probably what a lot of us as Europeans would recognize as the typical intercity train route. It's a frequent schedule, timetable, that operates in this very dense corridor. And The trains that are used on this are relatively modern compared to the rest of the network. They're still probably dated compared to what we would see in a lot of industrialized nations' train systems. But in the US, this is probably the closest you get to a European or an Asian intercity rail network. Now, the way Amtrak is organized, they actually have three distinct divisions. One is that long distance route. So there's 15 of these routes. They're very long. They have very low frequency. Then you have the Northeast Corridor. And then the third one is something called state-supported services. So the way Amtrak is organized is any route or any train service less than 750 miles is not included in Amtrak's charter. So Amtrak and its federal support cannot fund any route under 750 miles. That's why that long distance network is really the core of Amtrak. Now, Amtrak operates these state supported services, and there are 28 of these services in the country. But every single one of them, each individual US state is funding them. And you may identify a slight problem here because 750 miles is quite a long rail stretch. That's a huge corridor. Typically, states are nowhere near as long as 750 miles. So to actually have a realistic rail route, which is going to serve major conurbations, it requires states to work together. It requires collaboration and cooperation to do that. And that rarely happens. You have large states like California, where they don't need to cooperate with anybody else, and they have 3 routes there that you can see on the left-hand side of the map. But only really in areas such as kind of around Virginia and North Carolina, where the Departments of Transport have worked together to support a rail route, or up in the northeast corner in New England, where those smaller states have traditionally tended to work together better, and they have kind of established a rail network. Really, state-supported services are really kind of been an issue. That's subdued development of passenger rail in the US as a result. And to just give you some figures, so this is 2022 ridership numbers for Amtrak. As you can see, those long distance routes, those 1,000, 2,000 mile routes are carrying only less than 3 million riders. The Northeast Corridor and state-supported routes are the two that really are the bulk of Amtrak's business, that more or less split between the two, both of which are still way down on the pre-COVID loads. And the pictures at the bottom, the first one is a classic long-distance train. This is the Texas Eagle running into Austin on its way from Los Angeles to Chicago, another 2.5-day trip. The middle one is one of what I described as the faster, more modern rolling stock that operates on the Northeast Corridor. This is one of the Acela units operating between New York and Boston. And on the right-hand side is the classic state-supported service. So this is Amtrak, but it's actually California Amtrak. The Pacific Surfliner operates between Los Angeles and San Diego. Final point about Amtrak and the way they operate today. I call them the classic big train for a small job. Amtrak only has loco hauled services. It doesn't matter how short the route is or how loaded it is. I'll give you an example. The picture on the left-hand side is of a station on the Oklahoma City to Fort Worth route. This is a relatively small, it's a relatively small and short route. It only carries around 86 passengers per train, and there's only one train in each direction, as per classic Amtrak schedules. But it has 2 locomotives. It has 5 double-deck passenger coaches on there, which reflects that is all Amtrak has to actually use. So clearly, enormous efficiencies are possible by just looking at that network and how it could be better organized. The fact that this is something which is supported by the states of Oklahoma and Texas, it's the only way it gets funding. And then Amtrak is contracted to operate it for them. Number of inefficiencies in the way that the American passenger system operates. Of course, passenger rail is not just intercity longer distance. There are commuter and regional rail routes around the major metropolitan areas. There are huge ones which we would recognize. The New York system, which is what this picture is showing. Use of fleets of multiple unit trains, EMUs. Metro North and Long Island railroads basically are huge railway networks, about 1,500 miles of track. They operate over 16 routes, and they operate a frequent timetable. What we'd expect to see cities like London and Paris with suburban rail networks. But this is unusual. Other big cities will have a much stripped down service. Typically, you will see loco hauled services, short trains, really kind of inefficient use of infrastructure, and lots of them. I mean, there are systems that do use EMUs and DMUs, but I mean, this example here on the right from Tri-Rail in southern Florida, that's a freight locomotive hauling 3 passenger coaches. And in some cities, there's not even a rail system at all. So Dallas, city I lived in for many years, the 4th largest city in the United States, has no commuter rail at all. Atlanta, the same. So there are, and Houston too. So, we're talking 3 of the top 10 largest cities in the country, which didn't even have commuter rail at all. So it's a mixed kind of picture. But I'll stop talking about kind of glum and negative things, because there are some real kind of highlights on what's happening in passenger rail at the moment. And one of them is this organization called Brightline. So from 2018, Brightline started to operate a new service out of Miami in the south of Florida, initially up to West Palm Beach, slightly up the coast, and they've now extended up to Orlando. So this is over 200 miles of passenger routes. Brightline own the vast majority of this track. They acquired this from a freight operator. That freight company still has some ownership, but it does not really curtail an hourly clock face service using new modern rolling stock. Tremendous customer experience. The picture in the middle there is actually just one of their stations, and it is typical of the way their stations are designed. It looks like a first-class lounge in an airport. This is actually West Palm Beach Station. This is where you wait for your train. They really have transformed the view of what rail travel could be, and it has been very successful. They're already investing in making their trains longer by new coaches, and they're looking to expand this route out to Tampa, and that would enable them, I'm sure if you can see on the map if it's too small, but actually kind of also have a stop at the Disney theme park outside Orlando as well. So a real success story at Brightline. And the amazing thing about them is this is a private operation. It's a private company. So this is not a state-supported service. This is not something the state of Florida has looked to fund. That's why we have modern rolling stock, and we don't have those Amtrak big locomotives hauling double-deck coaches on there. Now, there have been public funds put into Brightline. They have been awarded grants for building this railway, but their business model is around the value that is associated with land around train stations. So this picture on the left is their station at Miami, and all of that buildings you can see above, the retail and living space, is really where they kind of making the investment. And being above a station actually has real kind of captured value. So Brightline is a good success story, and it is also really driving some really positive moves into the future. So Brightline's next project is a high-speed rail line, which will run from Southern California, so the Los Angeles area, through to Las Vegas. And they are building a dedicated 200-mile-an-hour high-speed, fully electric rail route. This will be the US's first genuine high-speed rail link, and it's connecting a city, two cities, which have huge demand. I think the figures in terms of the amount of traffic that Brightline say that covers between these two areas, but it's around 85% of this is by car. It's a 4.5 hour where there's no congestion, 4.5 hour journey. Brightline's trains will be less than half of that. And they'll be building 3 stations. So you can see 2 there. There's a 3rd one that they're going to be building at Hespera as well, all in that hinterland of Los Angeles. The one problem is the route cannot go right through to the city center of Los Angeles. At Rancho Cucamonga, which is the terminus, that is a Metrolink station as well. That's the Los Angeles suburban rail network. And then you have an hour and 10 minutes on that stopping service to get into central Los Angeles. But without a doubt, this is exciting. Private funding is going into developing this, but it has also got enormous public funding as well for this. And that is part of some of the administration's focus, which we're going to come on to in a moment. Needless to say, the Brightline scheme, and I think high speed in general, has really got a lot of attention in the US at the moment. I borrowed this chart from Ray Delahanty, who some of you may know, and his City Nerd series that he does on YouTube. Really, any journeys around between 250 miles to 500 miles between major city pairs in the US really is a prospect for high-speed rail. And what we're seeing is a couple of projects already underway. So this has been around for a while in California, the California High-Speed Rail Authorities initiative, which is between Los Angeles and San Francisco. A highly public sector supported project. This really started back in 2008. A local, a statewide vote that dedicated around $10 billion for initial planning and development of this. And the thoughts was that around a $35 billion program would provide a dedicated, newly built high-speed line connecting Los Angeles and San Francisco, connecting those cities in less than 3 hours. The truth is, and the reality since those early days, is that costs have ballooned. This project is now looking at something like $130 billion to actually get it completed. And they're also struggling because the decision was made that the initial section that is now being constructed is going to be this middle portion, so Bakersfield up to Merced. It's the easier part to construct. It can be done quite quickly. But of course, the challenge is it's not connecting either of those two massive conurbations, the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles. But work is started, it is underway. The project is still getting a lot of attention in terms of whether that increase in costs is worth it. Listeners from the UK and our experience with HS2, I think will kind of be, this will be an echo of what we see there. And also the central government, certainly on one side of the House, the Republicans really are questioning the value of investing such large amounts. There is federal funds coming into this as well. So the California High-Speed Rail project, we still don't have a date when this would be completed, but work is underway. And it is still enjoying huge funding from various kind of central government schemes and from the state itself. The other railway, high-speed railway, is in Texas. So linking Dallas to Houston, Texas Central, again, building a dedicated new high-speed route. These are two huge cities as well, both over 7 million population. Again, it's around a 4.5, 5 hour drive, more than half by having a high-speed rail link. And so being Texas, which is typically a very right-wing state, the concept was to do this entirely with private sector funding. And that was the plan up until a couple of years back, when there was a real realization that it really needed some public support to get this in. This railroad has complete eminent domain permission, so it has the rights to buy all this. That is not stopping a lot of legal cases that are still being brought by landowners, but they really have everything that's needed to build this apart from the funding. And the central government is now stepping in, and Amtrak, as part of their development programs, is actually looking at building this as part of their future expansion. A lot of questions in terms of how that would work, but this together with the California route are the two which really have got most advanced. There are other high-speed rail projects. I picked out one here up in the northwest of the US. There's an existing rail route that runs from Portland, Seattle, and actually up into Vancouver in Canada. So there's plans to convert that into high speed using some of the existing infrastructure, building others. And then there are groups such as the High Speed Rail Alliance, which really have what I'd call a dream map. I'd say this is unlikely at the moment, bearing in mind where the US is on its passenger rail. But you know, this is some of the ideas and some of the excited graphics that you see around high-speed rail. Now, let's go to what's going on with the US government. I mentioned Joe Biden. I mentioned huge stimulus packages and investment in infrastructure. So the $66 billion, which has been assigned for passenger rail, is really made up of two parts. Half of this really is kind of catching up. It's all the deferred maintenance, particularly on the Northeast Corridor route, actually kind of improving the infrastructure there and a lot of the structures, and also investing in new rolling stock. But the other half is actually on developing new services. And we're going to talk about some of the initiatives that they're putting in place for how to improve passenger rail. I mentioned about the new rolling stock. So these orders are in. These trains are being built. In fact, in some cases, they're already being delivered. So you see them on some of the Amtrak long distance routes. They're soon going to be coming out onto the Northeast Corridor. Faster trains. With this work that's happening on the infrastructure on that corridor as well, they'll be able to actually operate at higher speeds. And so this is really suggesting there's a bit of a renaissance. Amtrak issued this year a huge tender for all of their passenger coaches. Still seems to be a focus on double deck. It is a mix. The Northeast Corridor itself, because of the infrastructure, does not have double deck. But that means, you know, no longer 70s or 80s era rolling stock, either for passengers or for the power. And so what we're seeing through the government investment on passenger rail is a new map evolving. And this is a mixture of the government supporting high-speed rail schemes. So as you can see there, the ones in Florida, the ones in Texas, but also a real focus on, you know, enhancing conventional rail, whether that's its service improvement, so getting more frequency, actually somehow building the infrastructure to enable freight and passenger to both run on the same line of route, but supporting frequency and higher speeds, and also new routes. This is not building new routes. This is actually using freight lines to operate between cities that have not had a passenger rail service in the past. So how is the administration using this $30-odd billion to actually look at this development? Well, the first project is something they call a corridor identification program. So they invited states, and yes, unfortunately, it is still back to being state-led again, but states to submit proposals for enhancing the rail line in their area. I also did encourage them to talk to neighboring states so that, you know, two big conurbations that just happen to be different sides of a state line could actually have a passenger rail service put in place. 69 of these were selected. The majority of, well, no, they're pretty evenly split actually between enhancing the service of existing, which is the thick blue lines on here, or their new lines or new passenger rail routes on existing lines, and that's the dotted lines that you can see. All those 69 projects have been given $500 million, $500 million to go to the next step of their development. So this is a proper assessment of whether or not this is feasible or not. And the key part of that is they now need to start talking to the host railroads. So they've identified demand, they've identified the practicality, they've identified the value that could be captured and the economic benefit from putting passenger rail in. They now need to look at the other side of the equation, which is the practicality. How do they work with BNSF and CSX and Norfolk Southern or some shorter line freight railroads to actually make this work? What is the cost involved in doing that? So that is where that program is at the moment. And then the other program is on those Amtrak long distance routes. Another look at those. I mentioned before that they're all one train a day in each direction. Highly, well, not just infrequent, but also poor reliability and really kind of, you know, journey times, which is just not realistic. So this part of the administration's program to enhance passenger rail is to actually kind of identify, okay, well, how can we improve those services that are already there? But also, are there other services that we should also reconsider? So they started to look, remember I mentioned in the 70s that a number of those Amtrak routes that started when it was born were just kind of discontinued. They're being relooked at again, as are some routes that weren't even part of Amtrak, pre-1971 routes. So there is a very exciting study of new long distance routes, actually building a more realistic, for a country like the US, intercity rail network. So longer distance, these will be more than 750-mile routes. So ideas such as Chicago to Miami. You'll see on here some big metros like Dallas, Fort Worth, and Atlanta. I mentioned before, they both have one train a day in terms of intercity passenger transport. They're going to be a hub on a number of long distance routes which have been proposed here. It is early days, but it is exciting to even see a map like this coming out of the Federal Railroad Administration, which is part of the US DOT. Okay, so to wrap this up, what are the tailwinds? What is the likelihood that passenger rail is going to have a bright future? I think the things in its favor, certainly climate change remains a factor in moving from car to rail, even replacing domestic air travel, particularly on short routes. There is a slight generational shift in the US. The US is a car-dependent nation. It is built around the car. The interstate road system is actually a modern marvel. However, there is definitely movement. Car ownership is not only kind of affected by congestion, it is getting more expensive. The transition to electric vehicles is actually making car ownership more expensive, not less, particularly in a country like US where fuel, petrol is so inexpensive. And of course, the airlines are not really helping themselves with improving their product for many people. Some people thinking, for a journey of 200, 300 miles, why isn't there a train that I can take to do this? On top of that, we have Brightline. I mean, this really is a star and a representation of what is possible. And also for the US, it's important that it proves that the private sector can actually lead and have a successful product in passenger rail. A lot of Americans are saying that they want to see more money spent on passenger rail, so really supporting what the administration is doing. And, you know, who can't be excited by high-speed rail schemes? So from Texas and California, which are really completely different states from a political perspective, both of them looking at high-speed rail and have lots of advocates for doing that. And then finally, there's an election later this year. There is the opportunity for the Biden administration to get another 4 years in office. And I think that will help turbocharge the work that they're doing on the passenger rail side. A lot of the schemes will kind of go by the way because they're not realistic, but there will be development in passenger rail. However, there are headwinds, not inconsiderable ones. The first one is the obvious one, that private freight railway companies own the majority of the rail lines that are there at the moment. So for conventional rail services, that involves a lot of work in getting permission, getting access. This is a screenshot from a report done by the Surface Transportation Board. That is a regulatory body that supports passenger rail's access to the freight network. Over the last 2 years, they've been negotiating Amtrak's request to put in trains between New Orleans and Mobile. That's a kind of 150-mile route on the Gulf Coast and south of the US. Amtrak want to run 3 or 4 trains a day. The 2 freight railroads that own and operate on that route have been arguing like crazy. This is a legal battle stating the implications of having passenger rail infecting their line, how many kind of passing loops are required, all the different changes in infrastructure, the enormous cost and compensation that should be given to the freight railroads to enable this to happen. And that is just one small piece of railway. So imagine doing that for that rest of that network, all of those proposed corridor ID schemes. The other thing to bear in mind is that freight railroads have enormous lobbying power. They spend a lot of money. They spend billions each year on maintaining their network because they own a lot of infrastructure, but also they build lots of facilities. They create a lot of jobs, and they really do underpin a lot of the US economy. So they have a lot of power. And that, if you're arguing in terms of allowing passenger trains, even at a state level, the freight railroads probably contribute more to the state than the actual passenger rail development would. You've also got the issue, so high-speed rail doesn't need existing freight tracks. The freight railroads are out of the picture. But of course, you have the costs of actually doing this. This is taken from the California high-speed route. It's even higher than the figure I gave earlier. The costs involved, unless there is a top-down government strategy to say we want to have a high speed within our nation, there's no way this is going to get funded from a state level or from appropriations that come out of various administrations. I think we've seen in countries like Spain and China, it needs to be more than just transportation. This is actually about transforming a country and its infrastructure. I don't think the US is there at the moment for that. And then, you know, we can't hide from the fact that the USA, car ownership, way higher than really anywhere else. And the culture in the US, I think, has forgotten what passenger rail is for intercity travel. It really hasn't been there for so long. Amtrak, like I say, is more of like a tourist train. Certainly doesn't have good customer experience. Although Brightline is showing what's possible, there is a huge cultural change that would need to happen for the adoption of passenger rail. I think that is a headwind that we all need to be aware of. And then finally, I mentioned the election in November. So Joe Biden might not win. The Republicans might get into power. And it is pretty clear that they do not see huge investments in passenger rail as necessarily a good use of public funds. Although money that's already been appropriated will be protected, it will make it a lot harder securing future funding. And I think the states as well are going to struggle to fund a lot of this. Bear in mind the other headwinds that exist. So my conclusion is it's a cloudy future, I think, for passenger rail. I think we should count those successes we've had, things like Brightline, things like the high-speed line, which now looks like it's going to get built out in California to Las Vegas. The fact that Amtrak is getting completely new rolling stock and a new vision for how they operate passenger rail. But in terms of really transforming this, I would say that jury is out, and we have to wait and see. I think November's election will have a big implication on this, and you know, I really hope that is the case. But obviously, hope doesn't make change. We have to see kind of really what happens and if these steps can actually get that future. But a lot of us in the rail industry are hoping the US can join the rest of the advanced world in having a proper rail system. Okay, so